The grand ballroom buzzed with chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of laughter as if everything was perfectly in place. The air was thick with a mix of expensive cologne and the over-the-top perfume of some of the younger women. There were gold chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting a warm glow on the polished floors beneath our feet. Every inch of the room screamed success, the kind of success that I had worked for, sweat over, bled for, in the last 40 years at Harrison and Company. But tonight, all of that felt distant, a long, forgotten memory that no one seemed to care about anymore. I stood by the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon, my hands shaking ever so slightly as I sipped it. No one could see the tremor. They were too busy chatting about new technologies and future acquisitions, things I wasn't sure I fully understood anymore. My younger colleagues, the ones who had all the energy and enthusiasm for the company's future, gathered in clusters, speaking in rapid-fire tech jargon. I had a hard time keeping up with the pace they set. Those kids were always on their phones, buzzing with updates, ready to take over at any second. Greg, my brother, stood at the front of the room, practically beaming with pride. The director of the company, a position he'd climbed into with ease and charm. A few years back, I would have been the one giving the speeches. I would have been the one up there with the microphone in hand, rallying the troops, so to speak. But it wasn't my time anymore. Tonight, it was his turn. And judging by the way he stood there, with that cocky grin plastered on his face, I knew this night was going to be something else. "Folks," Greg's voice echoed through the room, and a hush fell over the crowd as they looked up at him. His speech began as rehearsed, his words filled with praise for the company's latest achievements, the future investments, the upward trajectory of our stock. People clapped, nodded, and smiled, their faces filled with admiration for Greg. The crowd loved him. He was the embodiment of everything new, everything forward-thinking that the company wanted to be. Then, like a switch flipped, he paused, looking directly at me, his eyes glinting mischievously. A slight smirk curled on his lips as he raised the microphone to his mouth again. "I'd like to take a moment, folks," he said, "to recognize someone special, someone who has been with us through thick and thin, someone who truly embodies the values of Harrison and Company." He paused for effect, and I felt my heart start to pound. The crowd went quiet as they turned their attention toward me. "Jack Harrison," he continued, "the company's worst employee of the year." There it was. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. Laughter broke out immediately, a mix of nervous chuckles and genuine amusement. Greg had delivered his line with a flair, and the entire room seemed to explode in laughter. My throat tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stood frozen, my stomach sinking. The years of hard work, the hours spent late into the night, making sure the company stayed afloat during rough times, suddenly didn't matter. Not to Greg, not to anyone in this room. I was nothing more than a joke. It wasn't just the words themselves that stung, it was the way he said them. So flippantly, so carelessly. Greg had always been the golden child, the one everyone turned to when the company needed direction, the one they admired, the one they believed in. But it wasn't just his success that hurt me. It was the way he threw me under the bus without even a hint of remorse. Like I was nothing more than a relic of the past. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people I'd spent decades working alongside. Most of them weren't laughing. They were uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond. Some shifted awkwardly in their seats while others tried to force smiles. But none of them came to my defense. No one said anything. They all knew the truth, that Greg was the future of the company, not me. I was just the old guy holding on too tight, clinging to a past that no one cared about anymore. Greg continued with his speech, using me as a punchline, his words cutting through the air like daggers. I felt small, invisible, like I was slipping into the cracks of something I could no longer control. And still, I remained silent. I couldn't bring myself to speak up, not in front of everyone. What would I say? That Greg was wrong? That I was still capable? Still had something left to give? It wouldn't have mattered. The crowd eventually returned to their conversations, the moment fading into the background like a bad dream. But the sting of Greg's words lingered. I set my glass down on the bar, trying to steady myself. The laughter from earlier still echoed in my ears. My pride had been shattered, and for what? A cheap laugh at my expense? Or was it something deeper? Was this really how it was going to end? A corporate party full of people who only saw me as a joke? A footnote in the company's history. As the night dragged on, I excused myself from the party, my mind racing with 100 thoughts. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I left the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled ahead, indifferent to my turmoil. I had always been a fighter, always held my ground. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had any fight left in me. I leaned against the cold stone wall of the building, breathing in the fresh air. I felt the weight of those 40 years of loyalty, dedication, and sacrifice pressed down on me like a heavy burden. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if it had all been worth it. Was I truly the man I once was? Or had I become nothing more than a fading shadow of the past, ready to be forgotten? I sat at my desk, the hum of the office surrounding me as my fingers hovered over the keyboard. The constant clicking and typing of the younger staff was almost deafening. They were always in a rush, moving at a pace I couldn't quite keep up with anymore. Their screens lit up with emails, messages, and project management apps I could barely understand. They worked quickly, efficiently, and always seemed to have an answer for everything, while I felt like I was slowly losing touch with the very industry I had dedicated my life to. I had spent 40 years with Harrison & Company, climbing the ladder, making decisions based on experience, building relationships, and developing strategies that I believed would stand the test of time. My approach was traditional, steady, calculated. I believed in doing things the old-fashioned way, taking the time to analyze, to think things through before making a move. But that didn't seem to matter anymore. The company, and especially Greg, my younger brother, had other ideas. Greg was always at the forefront of change, pushing for the latest technology, new systems, and modern approaches. He believed in speed, in adapting fast, in taking risks that didn't sit well with me. As director, he had a vision that was radically different from mine. He was all about innovation, an unstoppable force. I respected that in a way. But I couldn't help but feel like everything I had worked for, everything I had built, was being tossed aside as if it were irrelevant. The younger generation of employees didn't have the patience for the old ways. They didn't understand the value of relationships, the need for face-to-face meetings, the importance of strategic thinking over instant results. It was all about quick solutions now, data-driven decisions, and cutting-edge apps. I watched them as they walked through the office, talking in shorthand that I could never quite catch. They spoke about cloud integration and big data analytics, terms I had only begun to hear in the last few years. It felt like they were speaking a different language. They were confident, sure of themselves, and relentless. I could sense the shift in the air every time I walked into a room. The younger employees didn't look at me the same way they used to. Where there had once been respect, now there was something else. Uncertainty, maybe even disdain. Greg was at the center of it all. He had his finger on the pulse of everything new, everything cutting edge. I could see how he captivated the younger team with his vision of the future. They adored him. They followed him without question. And why wouldn't they? He had the answers. He knew how to work the system, how to make the numbers look good, how to present the company as modern and forward-thinking. They didn't need experience. They needed results, and Greg delivered them. But that left me feeling sidelined, like I was stuck in the past. I had always prided myself on being able to adapt when necessary. But this was different. This wasn't about adapting. This was about becoming something I didn't recognize anymore. The company was shifting away from what I believed in, away from the values that had carried us through difficult times. The focus was on speed, on profitability, on metrics, and less on the human side of business. I knew the company needed to change, to evolve, but the way Greg was pushing it felt like it was happening too fast. It was as if I had been left behind and no one bothered to slow down and ask if I had something to contribute. My office had become a quiet, lonely place. The phone rarely rang. The meetings I once led had dwindled, replaced by quick virtual check-ins that seemed impersonal. The team didn't need me in the same way anymore. They had their own ideas, their own way of doing things. When I did offer my advice, it was often met with polite nods, but I could tell they weren't truly listening. They didn't need my wisdom anymore. They needed someone who could get results now. I could see it in Greg's eyes when we spoke. He was always polite, always respectful, but I knew he didn't fully trust my approach anymore. He had his own vision for the company's future, one that didn't include the old ways of doing business. And every time I pushed back, every time I tried to remind him of the values that had gotten us this far, it felt like I was just a relic of the past. The older generation was fading, and Greg was the face of the new era. It was becoming clear to me that my time had passed. It wasn't just the business strategies that were different. The entire culture had shifted. Where once there had been a sense of camaraderie and loyalty, now there was only a drive for individual success. The younger generation was less concerned with long-term relationships and more focused on the next big project, the next big deal. It was all about moving up the ladder as quickly as possible, regardless of who was left behind. I watched Greg in these meetings, listening to him articulate his plans with such ease, knowing that the rest of the team was right behind him, ready to follow. But where did that leave me? The older generation of employees, like myself, was starting to fade away, and I couldn't help but feel that I was being pushed out, slowly but surely. It wasn't just the company that was changing, it was the way people saw me. The respect I had once earned seemed to be slipping through my fingers. It felt like I was no longer part of the conversation, no longer part of the future of Harrison and Company. It was becoming harder and harder to find my place in this new world, a world that Greg and his generation had built. They were confident in their digital tools and fast-moving processes, while I was stuck trying to keep up, unsure if I still had anything meaningful to offer. It was a battle of ideologies, one rooted in the past and one firmly planted in the future, and I wasn't sure which side I was on anymore. The night was supposed to be just like any other corporate party. Employees were gathered in the usual ballroom, drinks in hand, exchanging pleasantries, the hum of background chatter filling the space. The lights were dimmed, and music played softly as the night unfolded with its predictable rhythm. The annual event, an opportunity for the company to celebrate its successes, was already halfway through. But little did I know, the evening would take an unexpected turn, one that would change everything. I stood there, watching Greg take the stage as he usually did. He was the golden child of the company, effortlessly charming the crowd with his smooth talk and quick wit. I couldn't help but feel a little out of place among all the youthful energy in the room. Sure, I had earned my spot in the company over the years, but in moments like these, I often felt like I was just watching the world move past me. Greg had become the face of everything new, everything fresh and innovative, while I was starting to feel like a relic of the past. It was right around the time Greg decided to give his annual speech, which was usually filled with motivational words and company updates, that I started to sense something was off. His eyes scanned the room, and suddenly I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't the typical speech. This time, he was looking directly at me, his tone shifting to something more playful, even mocking. I felt the air in the room shift, and I could hear the subtle whispers of people turning to look in my direction. "Now, everyone," Greg said, his voice carrying across the room, "we're going to take a moment to recognize someone very special here tonight." There was a pause, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Our very own Jack Harrison, the company's worst employee of the year. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some of it was lighthearted, but there was an edge to it, a sense of discomfort. I stood frozen in place. I wasn't sure what was worse, the laughter or the fact that Greg was now using his position to publicly humiliate me. In front of everyone, he went on about how I was stuck in the past, how my methods were outdated, and how things just didn't move fast enough for Jack. His words stung, each one like a slap across the face. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was an open declaration that I wasn't a part of the future. My heart pounded in my chest, but I said nothing. What could I say? I could feel the eyes of every colleague in the room on me. The awkward silence that followed Greg's mockery was unbearable. I had no choice but to stand there, shoulders hunched, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. I kept my head down, the weight of the embarrassment pressing on me. What did they all think of me now? I had been with the company for 4 decades, pouring my heart and soul into it. And yet, here I was, reduced to a punchline. As the laughter slowly died down, I felt small. The years of experience, the hard work, the late nights, the countless decisions I had made, all of it seemed to evaporate in that one moment. Greg didn't even look sorry. His face was lit with a smile, as though this little public mockery was just part of the night's entertainment. The rest of the room seemed to take his lead. Most of them laughed, some politely, some a bit too eagerly. But there were a few stifled glances, people who seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of it all. And then, just as I thought the moment couldn't get any worse, something truly unexpected happened. The music, which had paused with Greg's speech, suddenly restarted, and the crowd began to disperse into small groups again. But before anyone could relax, a small group of sharply dressed men walked into the room. Their suits were pristine, their expressions serious. They moved with purpose, cutting through the chatter with an air of authority that made everyone pause. The room fell silent again, this time for a different reason. I stood there, still reeling from Greg's speech, unsure of what was going on. The men approached me with an air of formality, their faces unreadable. The crowd around us hushed, sensing that something monumental was happening. I was still processing what had just occurred when one of the men, a tall figure with a grim expression, stepped forward. He addressed me directly. "Mr. Harrison," he began, his voice low and firm, "we need to speak with you." I blinked, confused. "About what?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for me to follow. The entire room was now watching, the noise of the party gone. The men walked me to the center of the ballroom, a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere just moments before. I could feel the eyes of every single person on me, Greg, the staff, everyone. "Mr. Harrison," the man continued, his words clear and deliberate, "starting today, you are the CEO of Harrison and Company." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. My knees almost buckled. The CEO? I stared at him, not sure if I had heard correctly. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. The room was still, everyone holding their breath. "The board of directors," he went on, "has been observing your leadership for some time. They believe your experience is exactly what the company needs right now, to guide us through the challenges ahead." I stood there, in the middle of the room, trying to process what had just happened. Greg's face was frozen, his expression a mix of surprise and disbelief. The crowd was silent, waiting for my response, but I was lost in the whirlwind of thoughts. Was this some kind of joke? A setup? But I could see the sincerity in the man's eyes, the weight of the decision in the air. Are you serious?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," the man replied, nodding. "The decision has been made. You are now the CEO." Stunned silence filled the room, followed by a few whispers from the crowd. The party had come to a halt, and all I could do was stand there, speechless, as the realization slowly began to sink in. Becoming CEO was nothing like I had imagined it would be. The congratulatory messages, the handshakes, and the polite smiles of the board members had all come and gone, leaving me in a sea of uncertainty. In the beginning, I thought the hardest part would be simply adjusting to the new role. But soon enough, I realized the true challenge wasn't the responsibility. No, that was something I had grown accustomed to over the years. The real struggle came from the people around me. Greg, my younger brother, was the first obstacle. The shock and anger were written all over his face when the announcement had been made. He stood there, frozen, his eyes darting between me and the boardroom. I could see the wheels turning in his head, processing the news that the company he had been preparing to lead was suddenly in my hands. It wasn't just a surprise, it was a blow to his pride, and I knew it. For years, Greg had been the one with the ideas. He was the forward-thinking, tech-savvy leader everyone in the company looked up to. He had the charisma, the energy, and the connections that made him the future of Harrison and Company. Meanwhile, I had spent the last few decades in the trenches, sticking to tried and true methods, refusing to abandon the values that had built the company. In many ways, we were two sides of the same coin, different approaches, different visions. But now, our differences were no longer theoretical. They were tangible, and they were about to collide in a way that neither of us had ever expected. It didn't take long for things to escalate. Greg had always been direct, but now his words felt sharper, laced with something more personal. Our first meeting as co-leaders of the company was a tense one. I had called him into the boardroom to discuss the direction of the company, but instead of a productive conversation, it felt like we were sizing each other up, testing each other's limits. "Jack, this isn't going to work," Greg said, his voice tight with frustration. He stood at one end of the sleek, polished conference table, arms crossed, glaring at me with barely contained resentment. "You can't just go back to the old ways. The world's moved on. The industry's changed. You've got to adapt." I sat at the opposite end, hands folded in front of me, trying to remain calm despite the knot of tension in my chest. "I've been adapting for 40 years, Greg. I've seen this company through every storm, recessions, shifts in the market, and countless challenges. Experience counts for something, and I won't throw it away just because you want to rush into the next big thing." He scoffed, pacing around the table. "Experience is one thing, but innovation is another. You can't keep holding on to the past. If we don't evolve, we'll be left behind." The words stung more than I cared to admit. Greg had always been the one pushing for change, while I had believed in the steady, measured approach. I had trusted that the company's core values would always be enough to weather any storm. But now, I was starting to realize that there was a deeper divide between us, one that went beyond business strategies. This wasn't just about leading the company. This was about leadership itself. "You think I don't know what's at stake?" I replied, my voice steady despite the rising frustration. "I'm not here to undermine what you've built, Greg, but there's a balance to be found between progress and preserving what's made us successful all these years. You can't just throw it all away." Greg stopped pacing and turned to face me, his jaw clenched. "You're just afraid of losing control, afraid that the company will pass you by and you'll be left in the dust." His words hit hard. There was truth in them. I wasn't ready to admit it, but I had been feeling it for a long time. The world was changing, and I was no longer the one with the pulse on the future. I had built my career on solid foundations, but in a world moving faster than ever, I wasn't sure if those foundations were enough anymore. The silence in the room stretched between us. Greg and I stood there, locked in a stare, neither one willing to back down. It was clear that neither of us was going to change the other's mind anytime soon, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both wrong in some way. This wasn't just about who was right in business terms. It was about our relationship, our family. For years, I had watched Greg grow up, looking at him with a mix of pride and skepticism. He was brilliant, there was no denying that. But he also had a tendency to dismiss everything I had worked for, everything I had fought to protect. He saw me as an obstacle to his vision, and I saw him as a threat to the company's soul. Neither one of us was willing to compromise. As the weeks went on, this dynamic only grew more pronounced. I began to realize that being CEO wasn't just about making the tough decisions. It was about managing the delicate web of relationships and personalities that made up the company. And the most complicated of all those relationships was the one with Greg. The board meetings were the worst. Every time we gathered around that table, I could feel the tension between us growing. Greg would present his new ideas, his bold plans for the future, while I would counter with my more conservative approach. The younger employees, the ones who had aligned themselves with Greg's vision, were quick to rally behind him, offering their support, even questioning my decisions. They had grown up in a world that prized innovation above all else, and to them, my experience was becoming increasingly irrelevant. I found myself increasingly isolated in those meetings. The board members, who had once respected my judgment, began to look to Greg for answers. The younger crowd in the company seemed to take his side, believing that his vision for the future was the only way forward. I tried to hold my ground, reminding them of everything we had accomplished together, but it was clear that my position was fragile. The company was changing, and I wasn't sure if I could change with it. What had started as a moment of triumph was now feeling more like a struggle for survival. The power struggle between Greg and me was intensifying with every passing day. And though I tried to remind myself that I was the one in charge now, that I had been given this role for a reason, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was losing control of something much bigger than just the company. I was losing control of the relationship with my brother, and that, more than anything else, was what I feared most. A few weeks had passed since I became CEO, and things were still tense. Younger employees favored Greg's modern approach, and I knew I had to make a move. I called a meeting to show them I was ready to lead. Standing in front of everyone, I said, "We need to embrace change, but we also can't forget what works. I'm not here to erase the past, but to build on it. We'll adapt, but smartly." Some of the younger staff nodded, finally seeing the balance I was proposing. Greg wasn't pleased, but he couldn't argue. I'd just made my mark. The company's future wasn't just about the old or the new. It was about both